In 1938, the fighter world had already made up its mind. One wing, more speed, less drag. So why did the Soviet Union roll out a brand new biplane? That question is the Polikarpov I-153 in a nutshell, a deliberate contradiction. It arrived when sleek monoplanes were becoming the rule, not the exception, yet it kept the old virtues on purpose. Two wings and the tight, quick agility that biplane pilots trusted when a fight collapsed into close range. But the I-153 wasn't built as a museum piece or a stubborn throwback. It tried to cheat the calendar. The engineers reached for something distinctly modern: retractable landing gear, an upgrade still uncommon even among many fighters and downright rare on a biplane. Less drag, more speed. At a moment when speed was becoming the price of survival. And that's the argument. Was the I-153 a smart last gamble or a beautiful mistake? Because the VVS wasn't building for a peacetime airshow, it was building for the kind of ugly, low-altitude fighting where theory gets you killed. In the late 1930s, Soviet planners didn't see the future as monoplane only. They saw a mixed battlefield: faster monoplanes for speed and reach, and agile biplanes for the moments when combat collapsed into tight turns over the front lines. Spain helped keep that biplane faith alive. The I-16 had proven what a modern monoplane could do, but it also ran into uncomfortable lessons when it tangled with the Fiat CR-32. In the hands of a good pilot, a biplane could still make a supposedly more advanced fighter pay for every mistake. That was enough to convince Soviet decision-makers that the biplane wasn't dead yet, it just needed to be sharper. So the I-153 was born as the third generation of the I-15 family. Improve performance, but don't trade away the close-in agility that biplane pilots trusted. Development gathered pace in the late 1930s. It entered service around 1939, and production ran from 1939 to 1941. Right in the narrow window where the old idea still had one last chance to matter. The easiest way to spot an I-153 is that wing, because it doesn't look like anything else in the lineup. The Soviets called it Chaika, seagull, and you can see why. The upper wing has that unmistakable gull shape, a curve that makes the airplane look almost alive even when it's sitting still. It's not just style either. The I-153 is a sesquiplane. The lower wing is smaller than the upper, so it keeps the biplane's quick, close-in instincts while cutting a little drag and weight where it can. The goal wasn't to outrun the monoplane age. It was to stay nimble enough to roll fast, snap into a turn, and live in that tight airspace where a pilot's hands and judgment matter more than a clean aerodynamic spreadsheet. And underneath that distinctive shape is pure transition-era reality, a hybrid build of metal, wood, and fabric, practical, familiar, and still very much tied to the manufacturing world the Soviets actually had. Which makes what comes next feel even stranger, because they were about to bolt modern onto it in the most old-fashioned way imaginable. And they really did bolt modern onto it, just not in the way you'd expect. On the I-153, the main wheels don't hang out in the wind like most biplanes of its era. They retract rearward, and as they come up, they rotate about 90 degrees, tucking themselves neatly into the wing root area to cut drag. That single choice tells you what the designers were chasing. Not elegance, not fashion, miles per hour. In a time when speed was turning into survival, even a biplane had to stop dragging its ankles. But the method was pure old-school grit. The system was driven through cables, and the pilot worked it with a handwheel in the cockpit. No hydraulic lever, no effortless switch. Just you, cranking, while the airplane is still flying and the world outside is still trying to kill you. The payoff was real. Cleaner airflow, better performance, a biplane that didn't give away speed for free. The cost was just as real. Workload, distraction, and one more mechanical responsibility placed on a pilot at exactly the wrong time. Which makes the next question unavoidable. If they cared enough to fight for speed like this, what did they bolt to the nose to make that speed count? Under that tight, busy-looking nose, the Soviets chased the one upgrade that could make all that drag cutting worth the trouble: power. The standard engine for the I-153 was the Shvetsov M62, right around the 1,000 horsepower class. Serious muscle for a biplane, and exactly the kind of jump you'd want if you're trying to squeeze one more generation out of an old idea. But development didn't wait politely for the perfect engine to be ready. Early prototypes had to fly with the M25V because the M62 simply wasn't available yet. Then, through 1939, production and service aircraft shifted over as the M62 came online. Another reminder that the I-153 was built in a narrow window where everything was moving fast and nothing arrived on schedule. At altitude, the performance figures often land in a fairly tight band, roughly 275 to 280 miles per hour, around 15,000 feet, with a ceiling typically quoted in the 32,000 to 35,000 foot range, depending on version and test conditions. And that's the point. Even with more horsepower, the biplane layout hits a wall. Past a certain speed, the airframe isn't just draggy, it's fighting you. And once you accept that a biplane can only buy so much speed, the next lever is obvious: make every firing pass count. The I-153's standard armament leaned hard on volume. It carried 4 7.62mm ShKAS machine guns. Still rifle caliber, yes, but with a much higher rate of fire than the older PV-1 setups. The idea was simple. If you can't rely on raw speed to control the fight, you drown the target in bullets when you do get a nose-on moment. But even that wasn't the end of the argument. Soviet designers kept searching for more bite. Some aircraft were tested, or fielded in limited fashion, with 12.7mm Berezin guns, often referenced as TKB 150/BS, pushing the I-153 toward heavier hitting bursts. There was also the cannon-armed variant, the I-153P, mounting two 20mm Schwark cannons, a serious jump in lethality, paid for in weight, complexity, and the everyday headaches that come with bigger guns on a small airframe. And late in the story, a few hundred aircraft gained underwing fittings for RS-82 rockets. Crude, simple, and very much a sign that combat was forcing the airplane to evolve fast. All that firepower theory met its first real audit in 1939, over the dusty, unforgiving skies of Khalkhin Gol. This wasn't a staged demonstration. It was a modern airfight on the edge of empires. Fast decisions, short sight lines, and no patience for a design that only looked good on paper. The I-153's primary dance partner there was Japan's Nakajima Ki-27, the Army's Type 97 fighter, a nimble opponent that had already proven to be a stubborn problem for earlier Soviet fighters, including the I-15Bs, and even the I-16 in the right circumstances. The Ki-27 could turn, it could hang in the fight, and it punished anyone who tried to solve combat with a single tidy performance number. That's exactly why the I-153 mattered. It brought back the biplane's close-in instincts: quick roll, fast nose changes, the ability to throw itself into a turning contest, while adding just enough speed and refinement to make the matchup feel more even than the old guard. In other words, it did what it was designed to do. It proved that a biplane, in 1939, could still fight and win in the kind of low-altitude, knife-range engagements the VVS feared most. But Khalkhin Gol also revealed the shadow behind the victory. Every improvement came with a ceiling. You could add horsepower, retract the gear, pack more guns, but you couldn't fully outrun the aerodynamic tax of 2 wings. The I-153 could still scrap. It just couldn't pretend the calendar wasn't catching up. Khalkhin Gol didn't end the I-153's story, it spread it. The VVS had proof in hand that the Chaika could still fight, so the little biplane didn't get shelved, it got issued. In the opening stretch of World War II, the I-153 became one of the Soviet Union's frontline workhorses, the kind of airplane you saw not because it was perfect, but because it was available, familiar, and, at the speeds many fights actually began, still dangerous. Then the war accelerated and newer monoplanes started pushing it aside the way the calendar always promised they would. What's easy to miss is how far the I-153's footprint reached. It also showed up beyond Soviet units, recorded in service with the Chinese Nationalist Air Force, and, depending on the front, some aircraft were captured and flown by opposing forces. One design carried across borders by necessity, not fashion. And that's usually where the real problems start to show. And once the I-153 started showing up everywhere, frontline units, foreign service, even in enemy hands, the romance of that seagull wing gave way to the kind of problems you can't talk your way around. One of the most troubling issues was brutally simple. The aircraft lacked a proper firewall between the fuel tank mounted just ahead of the cockpit and the pilot. In a fuel fire, there wasn't much buffer time, especially with a strong draft pulling air up through the wheel wells, feeding the flames, and turning a bad hit into a fast-moving cockpit emergency. And then there was the engine. The Shvetsov M62 gave the Chaika the horsepower it needed on paper, but operational histories note a short service life, often cited around 60 to 80 hours, tied to failures in its 2-speed supercharger. That's the real verdict. The I-153 didn't just lose ground because it was a biplane. It was being judged by a new standard: speed, durability, and survivability at the same time. By the time the war reached full speed, the I-153 was running into a hard ceiling that no amount of tinkering could lift. A biplane can be nimble, it can be forgiving, and it can be deadly at close range, but it cannot keep pace with modern monoplanes in the areas that decide who controls the fight: straight-line speed, climb rate, and the energy tactics built around diving attacks and quick zoom climbs. In that new rhythm of air combat, the Chaika was always starting the dance one step behind. Production ended around 1941, and from late 1941 into 1942, the I-153 was steadily pushed out of the frontline fighter role. It didn't vanish overnight, it was too common for that. Instead, it shifted toward jobs that fit what it still did well, depending on unit and theatre. Flying where agility mattered, where speeds were lower, and where the war's demand for good enough right now could still make room for an old idea, one last time. And yet, the I-153 didn't disappear the way most in-between fighters do. Between 1939 and 1941, about 3,437 were built, enough to make the Chaika more than a footnote, even as faster monoplanes took over the headlines. What's remarkable is how many traces it left behind. A handful of airframes survived the wreckage, and modern summaries note that a few are still in flying condition, which is almost unbelievable for a late 1930s Soviet biplane that lived through total war. For an American audience, the most tangible proof sits much closer than you'd expect: an airworthy I-153 at the Military Aviation Museum in Virginia Beach, Virginia. It's one thing to read "seagull wing" on a page. It's another to stand in front of the real machine and realize this last biplane gamble is still alive enough to start arguments.